Hi everyone, welcome to the third season of the Emmy-nominated show Drop the Mic on CCP TV, the educational channel of Community College of Philadelphia. I'm Associate Professor Michelle Myers, host and co-creator of Drop the Mic, and I am here with two of our fabulous judges, English Professor Elizabeth Catanese and DeForio Barlow, testing specialist in the Assessment Center. The performances in Season 3 of Drop the Mic, recorded in the fall of 2016, turned out to be particularly powerful, especially considering national and international events of the day. So we thought it might be useful for us to provide some perspective for viewers. Today, we are going to discuss some of the performances in Episode 6. So, Elizabeth and DeForio, are there any poems that you'd like to start with? Anything that really stood out to you from Episode 6?
What you got?
Perhaps we could start with Gavin's poem. So there, in Gavin's poem, there was a mention of sort of it was a poem that was about parental abuse, but the metaphor was about a jar of happiness and what happens to that jar, the sort of journey of the happiness jar, giving it to a lover who then winds up taking it, and then it breaking it, being under the bed and such. And I think that all of the metaphors really drove home the point of what pain can do long term to people.
Yeah.
It can break your happy jar.
Yes, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. Gavin is just phenomenal. Like, you just sit and kind of imagine a lot of stuff that she says. I know whenever she came on to perform, I couldn't really close my eyes, but I kind of just pretended to close my eyes just to listen, to kind of absorb everything that she was saying, because it was really, really deep.
Yeah, before they performed, they prefaced this poem because so many of the poems that they had shared over, the various episodes that they appeared on Drop the Mic, they were talking about very heavy issues. So if you remember, the first poem that they shared was about being, Native American, but because they're not perceived as being Native American, people will say, "Oh, well, you should wear your culture more often, so people know." And then, and then they were kind of responding to that, in a very angry way. And then, in the other poem that they had shared, like when we talked about last week, is the addiction, right? The food, right? The eating disorder,
right, eating disorder.
And the addiction around that,
Right.
about the eating disorder. And then for the other episode, that poem was, I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but all of them were about very heavy, very painful, like this exposing this, and again, I think, as I mentioned in some of the other discussions that we had about previous episodes, there's almost a confessional quality to a lot of what it is that the students share. Like, so here, as Gavin is speaking, they're talking about the various ways in which they've experienced abuse from both their mother and their father,
Being pushed down the stairs.
Right.
Yeah.
Not having a happy place per se.
And the various ways in which self is fragmented as a result of that, and that is kind of embodied in the symbolism of the joy jar, right? What they call the joy jar. My joy jar broke, and then later they say, I really love this line because they said, I reconstructed my jar, but on a much smaller scale, So yeah.
I think the idea of fragmentation, I think the other poem was about deaf culture and also
Oh
rape.
yes,
And that also was
yes.
about fragmentation and not being heard and not even having language to express.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, thank you for reminding, because we talked about that extensively when we were covering that episode during our roundtable discussion. And so, yeah, like the idea of, the abbreviated sign, right, for rape, and how that, not only silences, right, but as you said, like the whole idea of the fragmentation part of it, the fragmentation of self, and not being able to, fully recover, because there isn't that, the vehicle or the mechanism, that it's not really in place, right, for one to be able to reconstruct self, because that support isn't there, and it's not even available in language, so yeah. So definitely a reoccurring image, right, by her, by them, and and then used in various symbols that Gavin will employ in their poetry, right? The idea of fragmentation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I thought that there was something really empowering too in Jay's poem, which was about addiction and alcoholism, and how some of the roots of that can be in not being respected for who one wants to be in society, right? That can lead a person to having all these addictions, self-harm because others can't see you for who you are. And I thought that was a really interesting theme.
Or you hide behind that.
Hide behind it, hide behind like the bottle, right? And yeah, rather than declaring because it's unsafe to declare.
Right, almost kind of like a working addict.
Yeah,
almost.
exactly, right. And so this was about gender pronouns too, and wanting to be recognized with the they pronoun, and people not being okay with it, and just feeling like insecure because of being trapped in not being accepted. So I thought that was really powerful. And what else?
But I think that the bringing up the issue of addictions, right, is something else that comes up in a lot of the students' poems, whether it's drug addiction or alcohol addiction or addiction to sex or addiction, right, to wanting to be loved. So there is this, you know, constant
longing.
Longing for love, like search for love, hunting for love kind of thing. And I think that goes, perhaps we can connect it to the idea of, because of trying to, like a coping mechanism, obviously, right? The self-medication, there's just so much pain that one is experiencing that, you know, whatever kind of comfort by any way that they can obtain it, you know what I mean? And recognizing that it's not something that is productive because it leads to these other destructive behaviors, you know, like recognizing it, but at the same time, the pain is just so great, you know, so overwhelming that they just turn to it because it seems to be an easy way for them, or it's a readily available way. Maybe that's another way to kind of express it. It's a more readily available way for them to kind of address the pain, you know, and temper it, you know? Yeah.
And maybe that could lead into a discussion of Black Cancer's poem. I mean, the idea of abuse of women as another form of addiction, as something that's pervasive and hard to stop. You know, Black Cancer prefaced the poem at the beginning and then again at the end with the phrase "love our women."
Yes.
You know,
protect our
women. So, do you guys have any thoughts about that, the poem in particular?
Well, it's definitely a very intense poem. The performance is very intense, and in terms of him, so this is obviously a poem where he's clearly trying to take on the persona, right? So what we've talked about before, whether it's an authentic I or whether it's more of a persona, he's taking on the persona of you know, someone who is an abuser, a man who is an abuser, and is a proud abuser. I mean, that's the other thing, is like the way that it's being broken down. He's a very proud abuser of women, right? And the women that he's in these intimate relationships with. And it's a really interesting, like, it's a deconstruction of the psychology of an abuser, right? And the way in which addiction is used as a weapon, right? So sex becomes an addiction, and then how that is also kind of overlapped with other addictions, like the alcohol addiction and the drug addiction and so forth and so on. And so, and then how he's addicted to the feeling of power, you know, because he towards the end of the poem, this persona is talking about the control, like he's getting high off of the control.
And the control could possibly be the way that he kind of respects and honors in his mind women.
Well, yeah, I think he is not aware. He doesn't get like the horribleness of it. I mean, from your perspective, do you think the persona understands it and maybe gets off on like the power of getting it? You think?
Yeah,
more?
I mean, it's just the kind of like it's the control element, and like I can't remember I didn't write it down. The exact line is something about, you know, forcing this other person's will to follow his. So it's his rules, you know what I mean? And there's no deviation from his rules. And so, yeah, he's really getting off on that, you know what I mean? And so I think on some level there is, from my perspective, and you both might have a different interpretation, but I feel like from my perspective, there is a recognition that this is not right, and the treatment of this woman or these women that's being discussed in the poem, that, you know, it's definitely something that is, you know, degrading to them and so forth. But because he feels like the persona of the poem feels like it's his right You know what I mean? Like there's a sense of entitlement
Yeah.
that's being expressed in that poem.
And
you
he
know?
can express his love the way he wants.
Yeah.
And and it's all done on his terms.
Yes.
So that's the
Right,
most
right,
important
right,
thing
right.
in this, is that it's all, and it could speak to his own sense of powerlessness.
Right.
Like we don't get too much of
Right.
the
Yeah.
background as
Right.
far as like other things that's going on in his life, but
Exactly.
in many cases, right, and this is not to excuse the behavior,
Right.
but in many cases in these situations there's a sense of powerlessness in other elements of their lives, right? And so then these abusers take it out on the people that
Exactly.
they can, right?
Right.
So it's usually family members
Right.
or people there in
It's like another form of addiction, right?
Yeah.
So right, with there has to be objectification. You know, when there's alcoholism, you are dealing with like liquid, with an object, right? But then the woman becomes an object of to release all of these other traumas.
Right.
But I think one of the things that is challenging maybe for a viewer is that we don't get the other perspective, the reason why, like the vulnerability there.
I think it's interesting though, because I think that there is, and I don't want to say there's a danger, but it could be possible that Black Cancer didn't want to bring those stories in, because then sometimes people have a tendency to sympathize.
Right.
And I don't think he wanted anybody to
I think that's a
sympathize
really
with this
good point.
abuser. I think he
Right.
wanted,
Yeah.
like, yes, there might be other things going
Right.
on in this person's life to make him so abusive, but and remember, the title is called Brutal Love. Before he started to perform, he said this is brutal love. And I think that the point that he's trying to make is that there is no excuse for treating women this way, regardless, of what other horrible, like whatever things you as men might be going on in your lives. He doesn't say this, but I think that it's kind of suggested that perhaps, like, a real man wouldn't treat, the women that they love this way. When he's saying we have to love our women, when he's talking from his own voice.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So I think it might be a very intentional thing that he doesn't share those possible backstory, because he doesn't want anybody to have that sympathy for,
And to focus on the issue at hand.
on the issue. Not take I think that's an excellent point. Not to take anything away from the issue,
Yeah.
because there are so many women who are being abused. I mean, so the statistics, it's like one in every 15 seconds a woman is being beaten in the United States, and that's an underestimation, because so much of this kind of abuse, is not reported. And we can go through various other data and statistics and so forth. But I think just bringing light as a man too, to bring light to this, I think it's very important to have that voice as an ally, of women. And I think there are a lot of poems actually shared in this episode that really spoke to trying to celebrate the strength of women, especially like when there were poems that were like homages to mothers. So if we think about Meek Boss's poem, it's a poem to her mother, and she's really trying to thank her mother. And again, like, there are these confessions about things, if we're taking the voice in the poem as being an authentic I, right? So she kind of, she admits to having been kind of as growing up, like, in a lot of trouble, right? She talks about smoking and selling drugs and perhaps doing some, like, robbing and and so forth. And her mother had all these hopes for her. Like, there's this one line that really touched me, where she said, your baby girl, the one you prepped for the spelling bees, and then, but I was too cool for school, kind of thing. And she kind of rejected all that. And then, but she also expresses that because her mother never gave up on her, because her mother believed in her, that some way, somehow, she would turn herself around. She kind of attributes the unconditional love that she received from her mother as being what saved her. And I'm already feeling emotional. Just the end of the poem where she pulls out her ID, her school ID, and she talks about being a CCP student now, and she kind of like thanks her mother, and she she attributes all that to her mother. Like, it's like, I know any other like, as a mother, obviously, what a wonderful kind of tribute to being a mother, but also just like the strength of her own. I guess being able, her resilience, you know what I mean? Her own resilience to be able to, whatever struggles and obstacles she's had to overcome, to be in this place where she's at Community College of Philadelphia.
And she's loving it, and she's loving herself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought Alicia, Alicia Dantzler, who's obviously one of our other judges on the panel, I really loved the feedback that she gave to Meek Boss, and that was, "I see you as the hood storyteller." You know, she said, and I think it's true. I think that Meek Boss does tell these really wonderful stories. You know, and obviously a very important message that's being expressed in the story, but just kind of like bringing us into these intimate moments,
Right.
you know, and giving voice to that. I think is just like really wonderful. Yeah, but what I started to talk about was, you know, the strength of women, and you know, because so many of our students are African American women, in particular the strength of African American women. Like Miss Dada asked too, like hers was kind of a tribute to The Color Purple,
Yes.
you know, which was very interesting. I don't know if either one of you wanted to talk about Miss Dada Ask's poem, but also that, like, clearly, you know, such an iconic book, right, by Alice Walker, but also the movie, because as she introduced, as Miss Dada Ask introduced it, she asked the audience, has anyone seen The Color Purple? So even though it's based off of this wonderful, you know, amazing book, most people have experienced it through watching the movie, you know. But yeah, you know, but women who are going through these really trying experiences, from abuse to the ways in which, you know, they turn to other women and might be being betrayed by other women, right, betrayed by the men, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But still, right, the resilience and the strength in the end.
And I thought our feature poet, Yolanda Wisher, also brought out a lot of women's issues really well, and just was super honest about details of female experience. So
and details of family.
And family.
That helped shape her and mold her to the person that she is today.
Right.
So.
Yeah, definitely Yolanda's poems was a celebration of the black women in her life that have like really molded her into being the woman that she is, but also just even more generally, like a celebration of the black family.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
for
Like,
sure.
you know, she talked about being a mother, and she talked about the experience. You know, she had those poems about breastfeeding and the you know, the gangster birth, right? The poem about you know, how she gave birth to her son, and even like love, you know, and even though it might not have been, you know, explicitly expressed, but you know, there was the you know, she implied, like when she shared the poem about this, you know, the scat poem, right, about the scat cat, and like, you know, kind of you know, trying to catch the eye of the guy that you're attracted to and so forth, and the various kind of guys that are out there. And then after she performed that, she said, "Well, I got the cat," right? So, you know, referencing her husband, you know, so definitely like the celebration of the black family with Yolanda, which was really beautiful, you know. Yeah.
I could relate to the Black Eyed Peas.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of experiences with Black Eyed Peas.
Just for the holidays.
Yeah.
Just for the holidays, New Year's, you have collard greens and Black Eyed Peas.
Yeah,
in my family. So.
But telling the story, right? You know, like with Yolanda, like these really intimate moments. So yeah, the sharing of the, you know, the making and the eating and those moments of the Black Eyed Peas. But also she had the poem about she talked about the double Dutch. You know what I mean? And she confessed that she wasn't very good, right, at turning, but she made the songs, right? So she found her way, and so then she shared some of the double Dutch songs. So like these small, these you know, really kind of, I guess. Very specific moments, you know, these very specific moments, but speaking into a larger, you know, message
that other people can relate to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think Rouget was doing some of that in this episode as well, in talking about the letter to a future lover, and about all of the, I believe it was weather imagery around recovering from previous disasters, and then those helping her in her future relationships as well. I thought her piece was very powerful. In a quiet way, in a similar sort of quiet, measured way that I found true of Yolanda the Feature Poet, and then also Stevie. You know,
oh yeah, Stevie. Yeah. I was just really quickly before we moved to Stevie, like there was this, because it's the letter to her future love, right? So dear future love, right? And all the weather imagery, but she says, "Put me in my place, but only if it's right next to you." You know what I mean? So. Yeah, very, you know, sweet, you know, kind of.
Her voice
message.
is sweet, so.
Oh yeah, she has a wonderful voice.
Yeah, her delivery was always really smooth. So.
Yeah. And then Stevie, this was like another poem to the, you know, to her mother, right? So we were talking about Meek Boss and that poem being like an homage to her mother, but this one is really about the absence of the mother. So very sad, you know, kind of poem, which we saw her do before when she was episode 1 or 2, where she talked about the absence of her parents, you know, and being raised by her her grandparents and so forth.
And this was, she was talking about the high school experience, and I thought there was a line that was powerful. It was just high school, and I know what's up, but I still, and then, you know, like long for the mother.
Yeah.
Okay.
The line was, I know what's up, what's down, and who's not around.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you
That's
go.
what she
Yeah,
said.
yeah.
So even though she was always waiting, like even as a child, like waiting for her mom, like the expectation or maybe even the promise that her mother was going to come and take her to the movies, and she'd get all dressed up, and her grandmother would do her hair, you know, and all that, and then her mother wouldn't show up, you know. And she does share kind of the stories, you know what I mean? Like she shares these, you know, perhaps her mother was addressing issues of addiction, you know, being in abusive relationships and so forth and so on, but still it impacted her, you know, in a way that was very, very painful. And then also the other thing that was really heartbreaking about this poem that just really, you know, made me feel, you know, just touched me in so many ways was, you know, towards the end of the poem, she kind of, you know, admits that much of her poetry is an appeal to her, like as a way to try to connect and reach her mother. And so she had this line at the end where she says, I try to tell a story through my poems, but you're not listening. I do not mean to be disrespectful. Mama, listen, listen. And so that goes back to what we were talking about last episode with this, you know, this theme of listening, you know, and here the one person that she wants so badly to listen to her is not listening, you know what I mean? But we're all listening. It's amazing. It's an amazing, you know, it's really an amazing poem. And she's another one of these poets that I think that, in many ways, because she has a quiet delivery, you know, and she also is reading, like both her and Rouget read off their phones. And I think that sometimes people don't give, you know, perhaps audience members, for whatever reasons, they might disconnect or they don't give enough credit to those poets who are like reading it. But these were some really powerful poems. Like if you're just thinking about the content of the piece, you know, just some really amazing.
Any thoughts on the cursing?
Well, yeah, you know, this is something that we've talked about before, and I think that it's important for us to understand as audience members that even if one doesn't really agree with how the language is being used, or, you know, if it's specific words, whether it's the F word, like we talked about the one episode where Jay Thorne had basically done a freestyle poem where they were really using like the F word, like it seemed like every other word, right? This is very, very, you know, couldn't miss it. It was very in your face kind of F words. And then, you know, we've also talked before about, and we've had students in the past on past seasons of Drop that might talk about the N word, you know what I mean? And some people being offended, you know, different people, even within the African American community, have different perspectives on the use of the N word. And I think it's important, and I think most people, and as judges, I guess you guys can talk about this. For me, as someone who's really tried to facilitate the space for the students to be able to express themselves freely, it's important for them to be able to do so in a way where they feel uncensored. You know what I mean? Because we're trying to give them the freedom to, because in so many ways they're silenced. You know what I mean? In so many ways they're not able to share their stories, and in so many ways what's being communicated to them is that I don't want to hear your story, but we want to hear their story, and we want to hear it in the way that they feel like that it you know, most accurately represents them. And so if it's going to be, if they feel as though what most accurately represents them and how they're feeling, right, in expressing this emotion or this experience or whatever it is in their poem, then they should be able to use whatever language that they want. And we should just listen to the message and not be caught up in.
I'm not necessarily caught up, but I think there needs to be a purpose behind it, not just to,
not gratuitous,
you know, just to throw an F-bomb
or
every other
value.
word.
Okay.
Yeah. As long as it's done with a purpose, I'm not opposed at all. I throw F-bombs on a consistent basis with a purpose. So I understand that, but I just think that if it's just for no reason, I don't understand. I kind of get lost in the cursing and not in the message. So, and I kind of think the message is the cursing at that point, and that's where I'm kind of stuck. You know, but if it's properly placed, I don't have an issue with it, because I believe in non-censorship for them as well. I think they should be able to express themselves how they feel. So
I think in some ways it's about, you know, it's about the craft of poetry. So it, you know, has time been spent thinking about how the language is working with the other language and how it's going to be received by audience. And so sometimes I'm thinking, about Namani's performance, which was a little bit less crafted and a little bit more storytelling oriented. And a lot of the feedback, from the judges, from the other judges was, this is more therapy for you and it's great, but how do we comment on this? And I think that the one missing link there is just simply spending more time crafting the language in the poem to make it a little bit more relatable for other people and something that people can enter more deeply. So I think that, with profanity, that can be true too. If it's shutting people out, then my advice is to go back to the poem, right, and maybe think about how it's being constructed. But from the perspective of a listener, I think it's really important that we listen no matter what.
Right,
it's
no
a
matter
container,
what.
right? We've got like 3 minutes,
Yeah.
and that's the time when it's your job to just pay attention to the message that's in there. See it as a finished piece, right? Know that see it as an intentional finished piece, and then take what you can from that piece without feeling, without silencing or shutting down what's coming towards
Right.
you.
I think for me, in terms of this issue of the use of profanity, for those people who kind of look at it critically, right, and they're very judgmental about it, I think it's disingenuous, because every person has a time in their life where they really want it. They need to say that, So even if it's like, damn it, or darn it, like even those, even people who say, I absolutely never use profanity, I never curse, I never, I don't know if they're really being completely honest.
Right.
We all have these times where we're under so much, stress or frustration or whatever, that we need to exclaim that frustration in order to be able to release
Right.
it. And I think that people need to be more honest about that, that everyone experiences those moments. And then if there is like this judgment being placed on our students specifically, I think that sometimes people, I feel as though maybe people need to take a step back and ask them why they're placing so much of a moral judgment when they hear our students use this kind of profanity, because I think it's tied up into other biases and prejudices.
Indeed.
Because I definitely think that sometimes, and people won't acknowledge this or won't admit to it, but I have heard, sometimes people, and I think this goes back to what Logical was saying in his poem before, just because I'm an African American man wearing a hoodie, somehow I'm automatically a thug. I'm automatically a threat. And I think it's the same idea, like when you hear, sometimes when people perceive an African American person who is using language that's very strong, even to the point of using profanity, it's automatically this judgment that's placed on them, like they're an angry black person, the stereotype of the angry black person, or somehow or another they're going to lose control over their emotions and they're going to attack me. Or like I've even heard people just kind of like say, oh, they're acting in a thuggish kind of way. Well, I think that maybe there needs to be a check put on that and say, why are you, placing that kind of a judgment on them just because they're using profanity? I don't know if there's any person who can say that they have never ever used something that is akin to the exclamation of some kind of profanity. You know what I mean? So I would just ask people to kind of do a self-check, on that. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. I have to, say thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you have enjoyed our roundtable discussions about Drop the Mic. We're about to view Season 3, Episode 6 of the 2-time Emmy-nominated Drop the Mic. We hope you enjoy. Oh yeah, we're supposed to talk to each other. No, you did great.
Perfect. It doesn't matter. You don't ever have to watch it. You just talk.
Yeah.